Denise Akafares had worked the night shift at Kavara Processing Facility for 6 years, and in that time, she had learned exactly how invisible a person could become simply by being awake at the wrong hours. It wasn't malicious most of the time. The facility's daytime staff, senior Doruthi engineers, administrative personnel, the visiting officials who occasionally toured the plant for inspections or ceremonies, simply operated on a schedule that never overlapped with hers in any meaningful way. She arrived as they left. She left as they arrived. 6 years of shift, reports filed into a system that, as far as she could tell, almost nobody with real authority ever bothered to read closely, because night shift observations were, by long-standing informal consensus, considered less reliable than daytime findings, the product of tired eyes and understaffed crews working the facility's least supervised hours. She understood the reasoning, even if she resented it. Night shift did run leaner. It was harder to stay sharp at 3 in the morning than at 10. She'd watched, over 6 years, more than a few colleagues burn out under the accumulated fatigue of a rotation nobody senior really wanted to work. And she understood why the facility's culture had, gradually, come to treat the night crew's reports as a formality rather than a genuine source of insight. She also thought, privately, that this reasoning had it exactly backward, and had thought so for most of those 6 years, without ever quite finding the moment to prove it. That moment arrived on an unremarkable Tuesday night, in the 11th hour of her shift, when she noticed something in Reactor Housing 4 that nobody, in 3 weeks of daytime inspection, had apparently thought worth investigating further. The reading itself was almost nothing, a faint, irregular fluctuation in the reactor's secondary containment field, so small that the facility's automated monitoring system, an intelligence called VEL that oversaw the plant's core operations with a level of precision no human technician could hope to match, had flagged it as within normal operational variance and moved on without further comment. Denise had learned, over 6 years of quiet, unglamorous night shift work, to distrust that kind of easy dismissal, mostly because she'd learned, through long, tedious hours with very little else to occupy her attention, to actually watch the readings rather than simply trust the system's summary judgment of them. "Vel," she said, pulling up the containment field's historical data on her console, "show me the secondary containment fluctuation pattern over the past 3 weeks, not just tonight." Fluctuation remains within established operational variance across the requested timeframe, Vel reported, its voice carrying the calm, measured confidence Denise had come to associate with a system that was, in her considerable experience, usually right, but not, she reminded herself, always. "I understand it's within variance," Denise said. "I'd still like to see the trend, not just the classification." The data, once she pulled it up in raw form rather than Vel's summarized assessment, told a slightly different story than normal variance suggested. The fluctuation wasn't random noise, oscillating unpredictably around a stable baseline the way normal variance should. It was subtly but unmistakably drifting each night's peak fluctuation slightly larger than the night before, in a pattern so gradual that any single reading looked entirely unremarkable and only became visible at all when you laid 3 full weeks of data side by side and actually looked at the trend rather than trusting each individual classification in isolation. Denise sat with that observation for a long moment, feeling the particular quiet unease of someone who had just noticed something nobody else appeared to have noticed, and who understood, with weary 6-year certainty, exactly how difficult it was going to be to get anyone with real authority to take it seriously. She filed a formal incident flag before her shift ended, attaching the 3-week trend data with as much careful, methodical documentation as she could manage after 11 hours of an increasingly exhausting rotation, and handed off to the morning crew with a verbal briefing to her shift supervisor, Foreman Yusuf Anwar, who had, over 6 years, become one of the few people at the facility who consistently took her observations seriously. "I want this to reach Senior Engineer Cobb directly," Denise told him as her shift wound down. "Not just filed into the general incident log. This is a drift pattern, not a variance spike. I don't think it's urgent tonight, but I think it's going to become urgent, and I'd rather someone look at it now than after it stops being subtle. I'll make sure it gets flagged, Yusuf said, reading through her documentation with the tired, respectful attention he'd learned over years of working alongside her that Denise's findings generally warranted. You look exhausted, Denise. Go home. I'll follow up. She went home, slept poorly, as she generally did after a long night shift, and returned 12 hours later to discover that her incident flag had been reviewed and closed without any further investigation. Senior Engineer Cobb's assessment, Yusuf told her, with visible discomfort once she'd read through the closure notes herself, attributes the fluctuation to routine calibration drift in the containment sensor array, expected to self-correct during the facility's next scheduled maintenance cycle. He didn't request additional monitoring. Did he look at the trend data or just the classification? Denise asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. I don't know, Yusuf admitted. I know he reviewed it for less than 10 minutes before closing it. I pushed back, told him the drift pattern looked concerning to me too, for what that's worth from someone who isn't an engineer. He said sensor calibration drift was a well-documented phenomenon, and that night shift readings were more prone to producing false pattern recognition due to fatigue-related observational bias. Denise felt something tighten in her chest, not quite anger, though it carried some of anger's heat, closer to the particular weary frustration of watching a concern get dismissed for reasons that had nothing to do with whether the concern itself was correct. I've worked this shift for 6 years, she said quietly. I know what fatigue does to my attention. I've made mistakes because of it, plenty of them, over the years, and I've owned every one. This isn't that. I didn't imagine a pattern out of tired eyes and too much coffee. I laid 3 weeks of raw data side by side, and the drift is right there, plain as anything, if you actually look at the trend, instead of trusting each night's individual classification. I believe you, Yusuf said. I don't have the authority to override Cobb's assessment, though. What do you want to do? Denise thought about that for a long moment, running through 6 years of accumulated experience with exactly this kind of institutional dismissal, weighing the cost of pushing further against the very real possibility that she was, despite her own careful analysis, simply wrong. I want to keep watching it, she said finally, every night. And I want to document it properly enough that if this does become urgent, nobody can say afterward that the warning signs weren't there. She watched it for the next 9 nights, tracking the drift with the same patient, methodical attention she brought to every unglamorous hour of her shift. And by the 9th night, the pattern that had once required careful cross-referencing to notice at all had become, unmistakably, visible even within a single night's readings. The containment field's fluctuation growing large enough that Vel's automated monitoring system finally, belatedly, escalated its own classification from normal variance to elevated monitoring advised. Vel, Denise said, staring at the escalated classification with a grim mixture of vindication and genuine alarm. What's your current projection for containment field stability if this trend continues at its present rate? Insufficient historical precedent for reliable long-term projection, Vel reported. Current trend, if continued without intervention, suggests possible containment field integrity compromise within an estimated range of 6 to 14 days. Confidence interval for this projection is moderate, given limited comparable failure data. Denise felt something cold settle in her stomach. Containment field integrity compromise in a facility processing the volume of radioactive material Kavara processing facility handled on a daily basis was not a phrase that left much room for continued institutional dismissal. She filed an updated incident report immediately, escalating the priority classification herself, and requested, for the first time in 6 years of largely uneventful night shift service, a direct emergency consultation with Facility Director Ashel Verin, rather than routing the concern through the usual daytime engineering review that had 9 days earlier dismissed her initial finding in under 10 minutes. Director Veren's response, when it finally came through the following morning after Denise's exhausted, overnight escalation had worked its way up the facility's administrative chain, was considerably more measured than Denise had hoped for, given what she now understood the stakes to be. "I have reviewed Senior Engineer Cobb's original assessment," Varen said. During the brief formal meeting Denise had been granted, her exhaustion from having stayed nearly 4 hours past the end of her shift barely held in check by the urgency of the moment. "Calibration drift remains, in his professional judgment, the most probable explanation for the pattern you've documented. I understand your concern, Technician HFY, and I don't dismiss it lightly. But I have to weigh a night shift technician's independent trend analysis against a senior engineer's professional assessment, and against Vel's own extensive historical data on comparable sensor behavior." "With respect, Director," Denise said, keeping her voice as steady as 6 years of exhaustion and 9 days of mounting worry allowed, "Vel's own current classification has escalated to elevated monitoring advised, based on exactly the trend I flagged 9 days ago. I'm not asking you to trust my judgment over Senior Engineer Cobb's professional expertise in isolation. I'm asking you to look at the fact that the pattern I identified 9 days ago, when it was subtle enough to dismiss in under 10 minutes of review, has now grown large enough that even the automated system, originally calling it normal variance, no longer calls it that." Varen was quiet for a long moment, and Denise understood, watching her expression, that this was the moment the entire situation would turn on, not on the strength of her data, which she believed was sound, but on whether 6 years of institutional habit dismissing night shift observations could be overcome quickly enough to matter. "Senior Engineer Cobb has requested," Varen said finally, "an opportunity to review the escalated data himself before I authorize any facility-wide response. I understand your frustration with that process, given the delay it represents. I also understand that a facility-wide containment response carries its own significant operational cost, and I am not prepared to authorize it without appropriate engineering review, however urgently you believe that review needs to happen." "How long will that review take?" Denise asked. "Senior Engineer Cobb has been contacted and is currently reviewing the updated data," Varen said. "I expect his assessment within the next several hours." Denise did the mental math, exhausted and frustrated in equal measure, weighing several hours of additional delay against Vel's own moderate confidence projection of 6 to 14 days before possible containment failure, and found, despite the genuine institutional caution Varen's position represented, that she couldn't entirely fault the logic of it, even as every instinct in her exhausted body screamed at the delay. "I'll wait," she said, "but Director, I'd like to be present for that review, not to argue with Senior Engineer Cobb's expertise. Just to make sure the trend data itself gets looked at properly this time, rather than dismissed in 10 minutes the way it was 9 days ago." Senior Engineer Tazrin Cobb arrived at the facility 90 minutes later, visibly displeased at having his initial assessment challenged so directly, and Denise, sitting across the small review room from him with the full weight of 9 sleepless, worried days behind her eyes, understood immediately that this conversation was not going to be an easy one. "I reviewed your escalation report," Cobb said, without much preamble. "I want to be direct with you, Technician. I do not believe a 9-day trend, tracked by a night shift technician without formal engineering credentials, should override my professional assessment of a well-documented sensor calibration phenomenon." "I understand that concern," Denise said, keeping her exhaustion carefully out of her voice. "I'm not asking you to trust my credentials over yours. I'm asking you to look at the raw data alongside me and tell me honestly whether it still looks like calibration drift now that the pattern has grown large enough for Vel's own system to escalate its classification." Cobb pulled up the data with visible reluctance, and Denise watched, over the following several minutes, as his initial dismissive posture gradually, grudgingly, gave way to something more uncertain as he worked through the full 9-day trend rather than the single-night snapshot he'd reviewed the first time. This drift rate, he said slowly, more to himself than to Denise, is inconsistent with standard calibration decay patterns. Calibration drift typically stabilizes within a predictable range once initial sensor degradation reaches equilibrium. This is not stabilizing, it's accelerating. That's what I flagged 9 days ago, Denise said, careful to keep any accusation out of her tone, though the exhaustion of 9 additional days of watching a worsening pattern nobody had wanted to investigate made it genuinely difficult. I didn't have the engineering background to tell you why it wasn't calibration drift. I just had 6 years of watching this facility's readings closely enough to know that this pattern didn't look like the normal variance I'd learned to expect. Cobb was quiet for a long moment, running rapid calculations against the accelerating trend, his earlier dismissiveness visibly giving way to something closer to genuine alarm. If this is accelerating rather than stabilizing, he said finally, then Vel's containment integrity projection may be significantly optimistic. An accelerating drift pattern suggests active degradation in the containment field's generation mechanism, not simple sensor miscalibration. That is a considerably more serious failure mode, with a considerably shorter timeline than 6 to 14 days. How much shorter? Denise asked, though she already suspected from the tightness in Cobb's expression that she wasn't going to like the answer. I would need to run a full diagnostic on the field generation mechanism itself to be certain, Cobb said. But based on this acceleration curve alone, possibly as little as 48 hours before critical integrity compromise, if the underlying mechanism failure continues at its current rate. The facility-wide emergency response that followed moved with a speed and coordination that stood in stark, almost surreal contrast to the 9 days of institutional delay that had preceded it. Full diagnostic teams dispatched to reactor housing 4 within the hour, containment field reinforcement protocols initiated as a precautionary measure, and within 18 hours, confirmation of exactly the failure mode Cobb's revised analysis had projected. A slow, mechanical degradation in the containment field's primary generation array, invisible to standard sensor calibration checks, but unmistakable once anyone had actually traced the accelerating drift pattern back to its physical source. The repair, once properly diagnosed, took just under 30 hours to complete, a tight but manageable window that would have been considerably tighter, Cobb noted grimly in his own follow-up report. Had the facility continued operating under the original 9-day-old assessment that the fluctuation represented nothing more than routine calibration drift, requiring no urgent action. Director Verin requested a formal meeting with Denise 3 days after the repair's completion, once the immediate crisis had passed and the facility's operations had returned to something resembling normalcy. I have reviewed the full incident timeline, Verin said, including the 9 days between your initial report and the escalation that finally prompted proper investigation. I want to be honest with you about what that review shows. Your initial finding was correct. Senior Engineer Cobb's initial dismissal, however professionally reasonable it appeared at the time, delayed a critical response by 9 days, during which the underlying failure continued accelerating largely unmonitored. I understand it looked like a reasonable call at the time, Denise said carefully. Calibration drift really is more common than active containment field degradation. I don't think Engineer Cobb made an unreasonable assumption, given what a single night's reading showed him. Perhaps not, Verin said. But I have also reviewed this facility's broader pattern of treating night shift observations as inherently less reliable than daytime findings, and I find that pattern considerably harder to defend, given what actually happened here. You noticed this drift 9 days before anyone else did, Technician Akafares, not because you possess some quality the daytime staff lacks, but because you were the one actually watching the readings closely enough, during hours when very few other people at this facility bother to watch anything closely at all. Night shift gets a reputation, Denise said, as the hours where the tired, understaffed crew handles the boring, unsupervised work nobody senior wants. I understand where that reputation comes from. I just don't think it's entirely fair or entirely accurate. Some of us are tired some nights, but we're also the only ones actually watching this place for 8, 10, 12 hours straight, without 100 other daytime priorities pulling our attention in 6 directions at once. That's not nothing. I think it's actually worth something, if anyone bothered to look at it that way. Varen was quiet for a long moment, considering this. I am implementing a formal policy revision, she said finally, requiring any night shift incident flag involving trend data, not single-reading anomalies, but tracked patterns across multiple shifts, to receive mandatory senior engineering review within 24 hours, rather than the informal variable response timeline that has apparently governed this facility's practice until now. I do not intend for another technician to spend 9 days watching an accelerating failure grow worse, waiting for someone with more institutional standing to take their careful observation seriously. Foreman Yusuf Anwar found Denise on the observation catwalk above reactor housing 4 that evening, watching the now stabilized containment field through the reinforced viewport with the particular quiet satisfaction of someone who had spent 6 years being politely overlooked, and had finally, if only once, been proven unmistakably right. "You look tired," he said, settling onto the railing beside her. "I'm always tired," Denise said, not without humor, occupational hazard of the graveyard rotation. "You could have let it go," Yusuf said. 9 days of pushing against Cobb's dismissal, against Varen's caution, against 6 years of this facility deciding night shift's findings don't carry the same weight as daytime engineering assessments. Most people would have let it go after the first closure. Denise thought about that for a long moment, watching the reinforced containment field hold steady, exactly as it should. "I've spent 6 years watching this place at hours nobody else wants to watch it," she said finally, "learning what normal sounds like, what normal looks like, so that when something isn't normal, I actually notice. That's not a skill anyone trained me for, particularly. It's just what happens when you pay attention long enough to something most people have decided isn't worth paying attention to." She looked over at him. "I wasn't going to let 9 days of being told I was probably wrong convince me I actually was, when I'd looked at that data closely enough to know I wasn't. That's the whole job, really, not being smarter than anyone else, just being stubborn enough and awake enough to keep looking until someone else finally looks too." Yusuf smiled, tired and genuine. "Well," he said, "for what it's worth, this whole facility's a little safer for having someone stubborn enough on the night shift." Denise looked back out at the stabilized reactor housing, feeling, for the first time in 6 years of careful, unglamorous, mostly invisible work, something that felt distinctly like being seen. "It usually is," she said quietly. "Somebody's just got to actually look."